Last week, I made a video about Redis, specifically how they had stopped being open source due to a license change. Yes, the code was still available, but it wasn't open source in the traditional sense, and it certainly wasn't compatible with other open source licenses. The goal was to keep companies like Amazon from reselling Redis, but the impact has gone way further than that. You can check out my video, Prime's video, or any of the others about it if you're curious about that. We're not talking about how bad this was today, though. We're talking about what comes next. All of the people, all of the forks, all of the impact, all of the change, and all of the damage this will do to the Redis company going forward. This is a video about the future of Redis and the race to make the new Redis. This article is really, really good, and I want to go over it. Technically, it's behind a paywall. I found this link on HN. I didn't know it was behind a paywall, but this was good enough that I'm going to go pay, and you should too. So if you liked this and you're interested in articles like this about Linux, about open source, about all of this chaos, this is going to be one of my go-to sources going forward, and I am absolutely excited to subscribe. It's only $9 a month too, which is just a steal. So if you like this, go throw them some money. They deserve it. And also, shout out to Joe for writing this phenomenal post. On March 21st, the Redis company announced that Redis's in-memory data store project would now be released under a non-free source available license. This is the proper term where it's source available. So it's not open source by the traditional definition, but the source code is there for anyone to look at, make changes to, etc. You just can't sell that source code. This news is unwelcome, but not entirely unexpected. What is unusual with the situation is the number of Redis alternatives to choose from. There are at least 4 options to choose as a replacement for those who wish to stay with the free software, including a pre-existing fork called KeyDB, which is the one that Snapchat made that's multi-threaded. Really good fork, almost entirely 100% compatible. Great choice. But there's also the Linux Foundation's newly announced Valkey project. This is going to be our first tangent. I already have the link open here, because this is one of the most interesting things that, when I thought about it, actually makes a lot of sense. The Linux Foundation launched an open source Valkey community. Valkey is Valkey, it's like key valve, funny pun. The point of Valkey is that Linux relies a lot on Redis, and Linux is obviously truly free and open source for anyone to use for whatever the hell they want. The Linux Foundation can't tell you to not use Linux. You can use Linux if you want to use Linux. That's the point of the license. They're very strict in Linux about what they do and don't allow to be supported on a kernel level, because they can't support APIs, SDKs, and certainly not packages and other things like Redis if they're not complicit with the existing license that's being used for Linux itself. So Linux cannot have something like Redis as a core dependency if Redis isn't at least as permissive as the Linux open source license is. Because of that, they're removing Redis from Linux, at least as like a core piece, and are instead forking the last version that wasn't licensed this way and maintaining it themselves. And if you know anything about the history of the Linux Foundation and the people around it, not liking a proprietary solution and then forking, you know the other solutions die. My favorite example of this is obviously Mercurial, which is how the Linux kernel used to be made. If you're not familiar with Mercurial, it was Git before Git. And when Linus was not happy with certain things it did, and the fact that they suddenly wanted to start charging him, he said, no, fuck you, we'll make a better one. And he invented Git. So if you piss off the Linux Foundation, that might be a death sentence for whatever you're building. Quick correction on the thing I just said about Git. It wasn't Mercurial that he used to use. Mercurial came after Git. It was actually Subversion, SVN, as well as Bitkeeper. And he did not like that they suddenly started charging him, which is why he drew the line and went and made Git. Sorry about that. Anyways, be careful to not piss off the Linux Foundation. They're good at what they do. Today, the Linux Foundation announced its intent to form Valkey, an open source alternative to the Redis in-memory NoSQL data store. Project contributors quickly gathered maintainer, community, and corporate support to regroup in response to the recent license change announced by Redis Inc. Valkey will continue development from Redis 7.2.4, which is the last version that had the old license, and will keep the project available for use and distribution under the open source BSD license, which is a very permissive license. Since the Redis project was founded in 2009, thousands of open source developers have contributed significantly to its growth and success. Many more developers use it for caching, as well as a lower latency, higher throughput data store alternative to their backend database for real-time data analysis, session store, message broker, many other use cases. Developers ranked Redis the 6th most used database in the 2023 Stack Overflow Dev Survey, and it was among the top 3 most admired. I will say that the average Stack Overflow survey dev is not the person who's using Redis. My guess is it would be even more than the 6th most popular, especially when you consider all the things that are reselling it with a different API on top. To continue improving on this important technology and allowing for unfettered distribution of the project, the community created Valkey, an open source high-performant key value store. Valkey supports the Linux, macOS, OpenBSD, NetBSD, and FreeBSD platforms. There's one platform missing here. It's a very popular platform, but wouldn't it be funny if our friends over at Bun beat Redis to Windows? Anyways. In addition, the community will continue working on its existing roadmap, including features such as a more reliable slot migration, dramatic scalability and stability improvements to the clustering systems, multi-threaded performance improvements, triggers, new commands, vector search support, and more. I'll say a lot of this sounds like the stuff that they started doing for KeyDB anyways, but cool to see that this is getting built and supported by such an important crew. Industry participants, including AWS, Google Cloud, Oracle, Ericsson, and Snap Inc., are supporting Valkey. This is the important piece that people need to understand. Previously, there was one company really supporting the development of Redis, which was Redis Inc. They were upset that these other companies were making money reselling their thing without paying them much back. So Redis decided to change their license such that they can't do that anymore. That decision resulted in all of these companies suddenly aligning themselves together to support our friends over at the Linux Foundation in building a better maintained and now also much better funded alternative. This sentence here is the actual death of Redis. Like, you could argue that what Redis did was like load a gun and hand it to you. This is all of the people who were handed the gun pulling the damn trigger. This here is the end of Redis. Snap already made KeyDB. This is, yes, like Snapchat Snap. They made KeyDB for handling all of their data storage for pretty much all of Snapchat. That's why they made it multi-threaded. That's why they made it super performant. But to have them supporting an alternative and funding it, as well as Amazon Bezos bucks, Google, Oracle, and all of these other firms, that's a game over change. I worked on open source Redis for 6 years, including 4 years as one of the core team members that drove Redis open source until 7.2. I care deeply about open source software and want to keep contributing. By forming Valkey, contributors can pick up where we left off and continue to contribute to a vibrant open source community, said Madeline Olson, who is a former Redis maintainer and the co-creator of Valkey, while also being a principal engineer at AWS. That's pretty cool. It's also nice seeing AWS and Amazon as a whole being a little more down for open source stuff like this. I know I had to fight a bit when I was at Amazon and Twitch to convince them to let me go do open source stuff that had any overlap with my job at all. It was basically like a don't touch video stuff because you work on video stuff. I could do other shit like open source random games and things. Technically, I would have had to get all of those approved. I just didn't. But yeah, it's cool seeing that Amazon and AWS not only are like letting people go do open source contributions, but clearly are making it part of some of their jobs. Like, it's part of Madeline Olson's job now to maintain Valkey as a principal at AWS. That's really cool. I am pleased to see the Valkey project come together to continue true open source development. The community's resilience and commitment to the project means we can continue the same innovative work that users have come to admire and depend upon, said Ping, who's a former Redis contributor as well as a software engineer at Google. And here's another quote coming from somebody from Ericsson Software. There's a lot of these Redis contributors that have been working on it for a while, as well as Madeline's case, actually maintaining it, now working on this fork. At the Linux Foundation, Valkey will follow an open governance model, remaining community-driven and welcoming of all users and contributors. The project has already assembled a technical leadership committee of several former Redis contributors, and hundreds more community members have voiced their intent to support Valkey. To learn more about Valkey, check out their GitHub, which will obviously be linked in the description. If you haven't already went there, go give them a star. They deserve it. They're at 4.9K right now. They should beat out Redis ideally, if all goes well. And it's also funny to say this like open governance, community-driven, welcoming for all users, because the Redis crew claimed this is what they wanted to do, but there was no evidence of them actually trying. And the Redis team also promised they would never change the license, and they just walked that back. If any other group had said something like this, I might be hesitant, but the Linux Foundation is like the core lifeblood of the open source world. If the Linux Foundation stops supporting open source is actually dead. But they won't do that. It's the Linux Foundation. This is their thing. They're well funded, they're well supported, they're good. So this is probably the single safest place something like Valkey, well, something like Redis, I guess, could possibly end up. But this is just one of these alternatives and one of the pieces of this crazy story. I want to go through a bit more of this article because, as you see, there's a lot of really interesting stuff here. I also recommend checking out these articles yourself if you're interested. So let's start with the short history of Redis. Redis has a complicated backstory. Salvatore Sanfilippo, also known as Antares, started the project to use a different kind of database with a real-time log analyzer application called LLog, because MySQL was not meeting his needs. Instead of creating a relational database, he designed the project as a simple dictionary database that stored a key value pair in memory. Its name is a contradiction of remote dictionary server. I actually didn't know that. Yeah, it's REDIS. That's actually clever. It has, of course, matured and accrued many more features over the years. Redis quickly became popular as part of the NoSQL movement, and he was hired by VMware to work on the Redis development in 2010. He moved to the VMware spin-off Pivotal in 2013 and continued to work. Yep. Around that time, Redis was getting more popular, being used by Twitter and Pinterest, among others, and it started to appear in Linux distributions. It was packaged for Ubuntu in 12.04. That is such a throwback. I remember rocking Ubuntu 12.04. That was the first LTS that came around when I was actually using Linux. I remember installing that on a computer for the first time my trackpad stopped working. Good days. As well as Fedora 18, which was pretty soon after in January 2013, and many others too. Support for Redis was added to AWS in September of 2013, which took advantage of and helped bolster Redis's popularity. Yeah. Really fast key value focused database just showing up on AWS one day was a huge validation point for it too. In early 2013, a startup called Garantia Data started offering Redis services and positioning itself as a better alternative to open source Redis. Garantia took a first round at funding of November 2013 and floated changing its corporate name to RedisDB. After some pushback from Antares, the original creator, the company renamed itself Redis Labs instead, because he didn't want them to have a name that sounded like a different thing on top of Redis, because it wasn't that. And yeah, they renamed themselves to Redis Labs to keep him from being too annoyed. This is also funny because the Redis Labs company didn't even have him as an employee. But he joined them soon after as the lead for open source development in 2015. He remained with Redis Labs until 2020. So yeah, he stayed for a while, long enough that he definitely didn't have like the worst time. He would have quit way earlier. But effectively, they like stole his brand, made it the core of their everything. He joined to help out for a bit and left. Around the same time he quit, he made a bold promise that Redis will remain BSD licensed. This was part of, I'm certain, his terms when he left. He made the Redis Labs Corporation agree, by the way, if I'm leaving and I was the open source guy, this better not go anywhere. We better stay licensed like this because I built this open source thing. You guys are maintaining it and it better stay that way. And they eventually doubled down saying that they would do this and then obviously afterwards changed their mind. So yeah, Antares got screwed. In 2018, they adopted a new license for their add-on modules that provided features on top of the core database. They made their own modified license just for this, which restricted selling the software or charging for services. The rationale is that these cloud providers like AWS were taking advantage of open source by selling the services, and they wanted to be able to make money off it so they could continue investing. Yeah, we went over all of that in the last video. This is a brief history of the other licenses that started to come out where things were partially source available, partially open source, restricted for reselling, all of those types of things. Again, covered most of this in the last video. It's cool to have like the formal history of MariaDB as well as Mongo in here too. The company dropped the labs from their name in mid-2021. I didn't know that's when that happened. I just still call them Redis Labs. But the fact that earlier on, they got pushback calling themselves RedisDB because Antares felt like that made the tie too tight and that they were like going to confuse people. So they backed off and did Redis Labs instead. And then he left. And just a year later, they dropped the labs and they just call themselves Redis now. But when they did that, they also committed that they will not change the license. They said it will not affect the license of open source Redis, which has always been and will continue to be BSD licensed. Here's the lie. The company also put in place a governance model that would place major decisions about Redis's architecture, design, or philosophy with a community core team. You get the idea. One would expect that the team's mandate to include the license for Redis itself. The governance page is no longer on their site, but it's available on the Internet Archive. They had this group of people that were the ones that had to agree for any of these types of changes. They've now hid that page. Hilarious. And obviously, this is the thing we talked about last time, which is them announcing that they're changing the license and the hell that is inherent to them doing that. Cloud versus open source. Proponents of usage restrictive licenses like the SSPL and Redis's RSAL have tried to position this solely as a battle between giant cloud providers like AWS and open source, where use restrictions are the only logical alternative and cloud providers are the only losers. I will say this is particularly funny because in previous times this might have worked, making it like, oh, Amazon's evil and taking all of our money. We're going to fight back. This is kind of what the Elasticsearch people did, and it kind of worked in their favor. Like I haven't heard many people talk shit on Elastic, but since then that started to shift. And another company that is perceived as bigger like this, that also made previous commitments to never changing things like this. That's also a core dependency of a lot of other open source things that have more permissive licenses. They weren't just fucking over AWS here. They were fucking over a lot of people. And I hope this is the part that we talk about here because they successfully got the Linux Foundation, AWS, Google, and Snapchat to align themselves together just to give the middle finger to the Redis Labs, Redis Inc. when they rebranded. 2019, Redis Labs then CEO Ofer Bengal was quoted as saying that there were many different views after Redis adopted its source available license. Yeah, sure. I have not found many supporting Redis in this case. Some people condemned a license change, but after the initial noise calmed down, and especially after some other companies came out with similar concepts, the community now understands the original concept of open source has been fixed, or has to be fixed, because it isn't suitable anymore to the modern era where cloud companies use their monopoly power to adopt any successful open source project without contributing anything to it. I think this is more a social and like cultural problem rather than something that needs to be enforced with rules, especially if those rules mean that the open source we currently know and love gets left behind. The fact that in order to own Amazon, you made it so Redis can't be included in Linux anymore, that's cringe. And there have to be better ways. You can absolutely spin up disdain. Like if you just started a social media campaign of like, fuck AWS, they should pay us for this. You could get some support and eventually they would contribute some money to you. But if you can't compete with Amazon, despite having a smaller team that understands the tools better and provides better solutions, you're fucked. There's nothing stopping Amazon from making the best possible deployment experience for Next.js right now. Except Vercel is better at working with Next.js. They have a smaller team that's focused entirely on this specific thing, and they're also the ones who created it, so they know all the things it can do, all the things it will do. They can make the best experience for using Next.js, and they do by quite a bit. They make the experience so good that I use Vercel for a ton of other things too. And those things go to other frameworks that then exist on other platforms, and a lot of those features get copied by the competition. But as long as they can innovate at a powerful enough pace, they will win. And when I read this, the subtle part underneath that I'm reading is that we were unable to innovate at a level that was interesting to our customers and kept them from just using a boring old Redis deployment from 7 years ago on AWS. And if you're not able to build a better experience on top of Redis, maybe Redis isn't capable of building these unique things, in which case you're fucked. Or you're not providing a compelling enough value to get those customers in the first place, in which case you need to fix that. This reminds me of when people complain about the YouTube algorithm and they're blaming the algorithm for why their videos don't get views. It's not the algorithm, it's people don't want that. And if people aren't going to your product because they see no value in your product over just throwing a crappy Redis cluster on top of AWS, that's your problem, not Amazon's. In the March 2020 announcement, Trello wrote that cloud service providers will be able to deliver Redis 7.4 only after agreeing to license terms. Yep, but nothing changes for the community. This is a lie, because part of the Redis developer community is Linux. They're not going to be using it anymore. The choice of the phrase permissive licensing is misleading. Redis is able to adopt a non-free license scheme for 7.4 and later versions because external developers had granted their contributions under the permissive BSD license. This is the sketchy part. Since it was previously licensed as BSD, all the contributors basically said, we're letting you do whatever you want with this. And this is kind of a mistake I made in the previous video where I talked about how I'd be interested to see what it would look like to sue them and force them to remove your code if you don't want to be part of this new license. But nothing would stop somebody from forking the original version of Redis or even forking something like Linux and going and making your own new license on top. The difference here is that the fork that changed the license happens to be on the same repo with the same name. But the old code is all still there and you can still fork that and go do your own whatever license you want on top. Because BSD is so permissive, you can do crazy things above the BSD license. If it was like GPL or even MIT, this might be a different story, but BSD is so permissive that they're kind of allowed to do what they want on top. It's hard to reconcile the claim that the cloud providers do not contribute with the actual commits to the Redis repository. I brought this up in my video too. The fact that the biggest contributor is Tencent, Redis is the second biggest, and then we have a lot of additional contributions from these other companies too. Like, they're helping make Redis great. And as I mentioned before, one of the lead Redis maintainers was an Amazon employee. This is just bullshit. They're just lying. Binbin Zhu is responsible for nearly 25% of the commits to the project. Some of the contributors without a readily available identifier surely are Redis employees, but it's clear that the company has not been working alone. Changing distribution model. So it should be apparent that the code contribution is beside the point. Redis is a venture-backed company that has taken more than $350 million in funding over many rounds since 2011. The company and its investors seem to have calculated that they can safely move away from open source to try and capture more revenue. This was such bad math on their part, because now they have much bigger companies building much better alternatives. They lost. This was the end of Redis Labs. I will be very surprised if they're still in business in 2 to 3 years. They're over. They have some reason to believe this is the case, if Mongo's results are any guide. I will say, MongoDB managed to start making money when they managed to stop being open source. That said, we've entirely stopped talking about MongoDB. It used to be one of the most common questions I got when I started YouTubing 2.5-ish years ago. I can't remember the last time somebody brought up Mongo anywhere other than in this controversy. So Mongo can't grow anymore. They can make more money on the people who are using Mongo in their cloud right now, but they can't make more customers. There's 2 ways to increase your revenue. You can increase the number of customers you have, or you can increase the amount of money your customers are spending. And they've now thrown away their ability to do one. I will be very, very surprised if Redis Inc. gets any additional meaningful Redis customers as a result of this change. But maybe in the future, the customers they have now, they'll be able to charge more as those customers grow and the tools they offer to those customers appear and cost additional money. But I really struggle to fathom a world where even Mongo can meaningfully continue to grow its number of customers, much less Redis. Shortly afterward, major Linux distributions stopped packaging the database because it no longer met their licensing standards. But by that time, the company had set its sights on a platform model that would encourage devs and their employers to use and pay for Mongo and ancillary offerings with the as-a-service model. I will also say that the Mongo stuff put a huge fire under the asses of everybody working on DynamoDB at Amazon, which has now become the actual use case for a document data store. So yeah, Mongo hurt themselves greatly by doing this, even if they could make slightly more money in the medium term. This is a good quote from Stephen O'Grady, who founded RedMonk. As developers began to assert control over technical selection and direction in increasing numbers, even in situations where a proprietary alternative is technically superior, the sheer accessibility of open source software gave it an enormous market advantage. This is a really important piece. In olden days, devs were not the ones who made technical decisions about what we used for dev. Most of the time, the tools you were using were determined by higher-ups who had never coded before, or sales teams, or all these other things. So if you were a dev and you knew one tool was better, but somebody on marketing or sales or some boss that's never coded before went out to dinner with some rich person at another company and was convinced to use their service instead, it doesn't matter if you know what's best, they were picking. That has slowly started to change, specifically as devs have become the CEOs of these companies, have become founders of their own things, and have started to do more and more. The normalization of devs as decision makers has made it so open source is much more important. As he said here, even in situations where proprietary alternative is technically superior, the accessibility of open source software gave it an enormous market advantage, with devs making the decision. Choosing between adequate option A that could be downloaded instantly and theoretically superior option B gated by a salesperson was not in fact a choice. Yeah. How many of y'all, let's see some chat. Drop a 1 in chat if you've had a product you were considering using and they had a book a call button that you had to click if you wanted to use it and you just ignored it from that point forward. Let's see some 1s in chat if you've chosen to not use a thing because you had to do a call to start using that thing. Look at all those first-time chatters speaking out because of how real that experience is. Devs don't want to get on a fucking phone call to try out your tool. It's yeah, make fun of me for this. I deserve it. We need to work on this too with upload thing. I get it. Yeah, you can make fun of me for it as well. But yeah, getting on calls with your customers is really valuable. And I totally understand why they want to do that. But the average dev does not want to get on a call. They want to build shit. So if you're blocking their ability to build on a phone call they don't want to do, you've just thrown away a massive potential sales funnel. This is a fair point actually as well, that not only can you try upload thing without doing that, you can actually get pretty far with the 100 gig plan for $10 a month. The number of apps that are over 100 gigs that we have on our service right now is not particularly high. You can do a lot with 100 gigs. So yeah, if you're using this as like a crazy video platform, obviously you're gonna need to be custom, but you can get really far here. Grady also said that open source is typically less convenient than service-based alternatives, which is where you can have some really cool stuff happen. If you have an open source trusted solution and you combine that with a service that makes it way easier to use, that's a great win. They talk about lock-in here. I don't love the term lock-in because basically everything that is a service has some amount of lock-in in quotes. But yeah, this is fair, especially when you realize that like you can't deploy MongoDB other services without setting it up yourself. Like theoretically, I could move from Vercel to Netlify with Next.js right now without suffering too much pain. It would be totally reusable. Going from Mongo Cloud over to AWS sucks because I can't click the deploy Mongo button anymore. They're not allowed to do that anymore. Is this good for business? Mongo has kept growing, adding customers, and have brought in $1.68 billion in its last... How the fuck is Mongo making $1.6 billion? I hate this industry. The 30% increase in its Atlas database service revenue also increased by more than 30%. They only have 48,000 customers? We have more users than that on an upload thing. How much are they charging these poor people? Do they have like how much it's grown over time here? Okay, their customers excludes use of their free offerings. So it's only people who have paid. Okay, we do not have anywhere near that many upload thing people. That's fair. But here we see like their rate of growth for new customers, like to gain 1,000 customers in a quarter is tiny. And the only way you can survive as a business doing this is if you're charging those customers absurd amounts of money, like absurd amounts, which is like the crazy thing here. That's probably my favorite number in this. 46,400, almost 2,000 are paying 100K. So we calculate that 46,400. That's 5% of their customers are paying over 100K a year. They changed market segments when they made this change. Previously, Mongo was a thing that new devs used with their Node.js Express apps when they were setting up Angular for the first time. Now, Mongo's a thing they sell to companies that don't know what they're doing, and they charge them a shitload of money for it. They've fundamentally changed the way that they operate as a business by changing this open source thing. And they've been able to make money off that, but it's, yeah. I don't think Redis is capable of doing this. I don't think the Redis product is capable enough. And I certainly don't think the Redis open source project that has now been closed source, or not closed source, source restricted, has enough value, especially when you consider how good the forks are. In fact, Previously, it was better to use KeyDB than Redis if you were deploying yourself or even using a service because KeyDB was so much more performant. So I don't expect this to really help them at all, especially when you consider Upstash, who, yes, Upstash has paid me. Upstash is not a current sponsor, but they've been a sponsor on and off for a long time. I love these guys. They just hired Josh Tried Coding, who's another wonderful software dev YouTuber. They were really concerned when this stuff changed because obviously they're like a Redis as a service thing, but they're not actually Redis behind the scenes. So they're not affected by this at all. Most of these companies were or were considering Redis alternatives. Like Redis has made it harder for them to compete because they have the slower solution that they've restricted the source of that will no longer get contributions from all these other places. Ugh, you get the point. Let's go back to this. Oh, I missed this part. How the fuck is Mongo spending $2 billion a year? What? What the fuck? I didn't know that. These numbers are insane. They're spending $782 million a year on just sales and marketing. That's because they get no free marketing anymore because they're not open source anymore. So no one's talking about them anymore. The only way they can get customers is spending nearly $1 billion a year on marketing to find the customers. That is a different business model. I don't know any other like modern open source tool technology companies that are spending anywhere near this on their straight up fucking marketing. That's insane. That is an insane number. And it's still going up a bunch too. It went up almost like 100 million in the last year. They're fucked. And if they have to keep spending this much to get customers, and they're spending 1.5 just on sales, marketing, and admin alone, $1.5 billion, and their total profit was $1.68 billion, every additional expense immediately levels this out. You're fucked. This is the only reason their decision to close source lets their revenue go up, because they're throwing away so much money at sales and marketing. Okay. And I am positive that Redis does not have the money to do that, so they're fucked. Investors may be more interested in stock price rather than actual profit. Sure. Company stock price started at $33 a share, and now it's over $350 a share. I don't know how a company can be valued this high when they're incapable of making a profit, but cool. I am not giving investor advice. Don't take any of this seriously. I cannot imagine investing in fucking Redis. I might go short them after this. Forks and alternatives. Venture-backed vendors seem to have, as O'Grady wrote last year, reached a consensus that they can move away from open source, especially if they're not actively opposed by other commercial interest foundations and other interest industry participants. Here, Redis may have miscalculated the industry mood. Yep, that's what I've been saying. They seem to think people like Redis itself more than what Redis provides and the API on top of it, and also the amount the community relies on it. They were just wrong about something. Like, as they pointed out here, they straight up lied, saying that the cost of maintaining it was really high and nobody else was helping. And as we see here, a large number of the commits were not from Redis themselves. So they were just wrong. When HashiCorp adopted the BSL for its project last year, a fork of its Terraform project appeared within days and was embraced by the Linux Foundation under the name OpenTofu. Also a really important point. If you weren't around for the Terraform changes, HashiCorp wanted to make sure they could sell Terraform exclusively, as is the case with a few of these. And immediately, the Linux Foundation forked it on the last viable version and made it fully open source and permissive as part of the Linux Foundation. OpenTofu is great and lets anyone use this Terraform fork without issue. Great stuff. And as mentioned here, the same Linux Foundation are now the ones that are making Valkey and are supported by quite a long list of important companies. Olsen wrote that she and various former Redis contributors had started working on a fork within days of the change, using the original 3-clause BSD license with placeholder KV as the temporary name. That's a dope name. Placeholder KV is the temp version. I almost wish they kept that. I understand you can't, but yeah. Olsen, Zhao, Victor, and Peng Zi were all listed as maintainers. Olsen had an important comment here I really want to highlight. She specified that even though she's at AWS, this isn't an AWS fork of Redis. It's her attempt to try and keep continuity with the community. Really pumped that Olsen's the one doing this because like she's a maintainer, and I understand people are going to be concerned like, oh my God, it's AWS trying to take this over. No, it's a person who helped maintain Redis trying to make sure it continues to have a community and everything that she's been working with this whole time. They considered KeyDB, but it had diverged to the point where it was missing a lot of stuff the community is used to. Also a really good, valuable point that I hadn't heard from anybody before. The KeyDB fork was created in 2019 for technical rather than licensing reasons. The project, which billed itself as a fast drop-in alternative to Redis, was created by John Sully, Eric Blankarn, and Ben Shermill, who wanted a multi-threaded version and were not able to persuade Redis maintainers to go in that direction. Sully and Shermill started a company, also called KeyDB, that offered a proprietary enterprise version. The entire codebase became fully open source under the BSD clause when KeyDB was acquired by Snap in 2022. The problem with KeyDB as a direct alternative is that it hasn't kept up with Redis since it forked. It still lacks many of the features found in Redis 7, and Sully indicated there's little time for him to work on issues not directly affecting Snap. Though this project would of course welcome outside help, and we can certainly name additional maintainers if there is community interest in helping. On March 22nd, Sully updated another issue and said he was in discussion to potentially add maintainers to bring KeyDB closer to Redis 7. It's not clear yet whether Valkey will support KeyDB, but Snap's involvement makes this seem likely over long term. Cool to see. Although it is good to know why KDB is not like up to date with Redis. Really useful stuff here. Devault from SourceHut also did a fork that was using LGPL v3. In his announcement, he said that this was a deliberate choice that balances a number of concerns. Specifically, he wanted a copyleft license that was as easy as possible for users to comply with the license and ease integrations with Redis-compatible modules or Lua plugins. Provides a comfortable and familiar experience for anybody comfortable with the GitHub-based community. It's interesting that he didn't put it on SourceHut, but he put it on Codeberg. What the fuck's Codeberg? Have any of you guys heard of Codeberg before? One's in chat if you've heard of Codeberg, two's in chats if you haven't. I'm expecting a lot of twos. Two if you've never heard of Codeberg, one if you have. Yeah, mostly twos. What the fuck is Codeberg? Another contender, well, kind of, is Microsoft's Garnet. I'd actually heard about this before, and funny enough, it happened right before all the drama, not during or after, which was really interesting. They had built a KV cache store around the same time. This shit's weird, but yeah. It also works with existing Redis clients, which is cool too. Let's see what they have to say here. According to the announcement, it has been in development by Microsoft Research since 2021. It's a remote cache store that can cache and manage the same types of data as Redis, and it's designed to be compatible with the Redis serialization protocol. MIT license written in .NET C#. What? A .NET-based alternative to Redis. Interesting. I want to figure out how that performs. It's not meant to be a direct drop-in replacement, but its API compatibility page claims it can be regarded as a close enough starting point that works unmodified with many Redis clients. Cool. One user attempted to switch a Node app over, but found the Redis flush all command is not supported. Good to know. And now the scramble for alternatives. Linux distributions are left with a mess to clean up. This is a really important point because most Linux distributions are very permissively licensed, so you can't include things that aren't. This has been a problem for things like ZFS. The ZFS licensing history has been chaos for a while. They're currently under the CDDL license, which is not quite as permissive as it needs to be for Linux. They even have a note here. The Linux kernel is licensed under the GNU GPL. While both are free open source licenses, they are restrictive licenses. The combination of them causes problems because it prevents using pieces of code exclusively available under one license with the pieces of code under, okay, this is their attempt at justifying it. It's because their license is very restrictive and they're bullshit about it. So Linus is specifically known for being very mad about ZFS and refusing to support it because of the incompatibility in their licenses and how shitty the ZFS guys have been about it this whole time. The point of what I went on for that tangent here is that these Linux distributions, and obviously Linux itself, they need the license to be as permissive, if not more permissive, than what they are doing at the time. Because you can't change the license for Ubuntu because one of your dependencies decided to go haywire. That just makes no fucking sense. Because of that, all of these Linux distributions needed to figure out what are we going to do to keep having Redis in our stuff. And this is what they've done as a result. Neil Gampa opened a discussion on Fedora development list, noting the license changes and the need to remove Redis from Fedora. Jonathan Wright replied that KDB might be a replacement. He had already been loosely working on packaging before the license changes. He also said that KDB would be a step backwards and would cause headaches for those looking to replace later versions of Redis. But yeah, he was actually starting to test KDB in Fedora though. Shortly after the Valkey announcement, Wright wrote that he'd be packaging it as soon as there's a tagged release. So once Valkey was announced by the Linux Foundation, Fedora immediately was like, cool, we're doing this instead. Makes sense. Wright also said that he anticipates Valkey becoming the de facto replacement for Redis in most places. That checks out. Gampa also raised the issue of OpenSUSE's factory discussion lists. Yep, cool. They initially were looking at KDB and Redict, but then Valkey probably is going to become the solution. Yada, yada. Everyone's just moving to Valkey. Having to find a replacement to ship in place of Redis is not the only problem for community distributions. Jacob Mikulski called out several services in use by the OpenSUSE project that will need a Redis replacement, including Pagure, which is their code host. This is another weird GitHub alternative. What's with all the weird GitHub alternatives in the Linux community? Jesus Christ. Ugh. Anyways. It's also the thing that they're using for their OpenSUSE everything. I swear, they just don't want to be in the open source ecosystem. They just want to be open source. Ugh. One more person who was trying to get this added to their Linux distribution said that KDB might be lacking some features compared to Redis 7, but we've neither noticed nor do we miss any or felt that we were missing out on anything. Good to know that at least some of these people don't feel like they missed anything. Joe Verse said that it was too early to tell whether newer forks would continue to be maintained and that Redis LGPL v3 license might also be problematic for the ecosystem. Yada, yada, good to know. But yeah, now that Valkey's announced, I think we'll probably go further with packaging KDB for Debian at least, and if it dies out, we can always remove or transition out from there. Interesting to see that Debian's going to be going KDB. It is, of course, too soon to predict whether one or more of these forks will gain significant traction, but it seems likely that Valkey will be a credible alternative. The possibility of a swift fork with widespread community and industry backing should give pause to vendors who expect a smooth path after abandoning open source. Yep, anybody who thought the MongoDB closing source worked, this is now proof it doesn't. And this will hopefully change the idea that restricting your source after the fact is a way to make money, because it's going to kill this company. I honestly can't put it better than the author put it here, so I'm going to end it there. Once again, huge shout out to Joe for writing this. Go pay him. Go support LWN. This was great. And until next time, peace, nerds.